Thank you very much for coming, guys. Lovely to see a couple of new faces, but also to see all the familiar faces for my final talk here of this period, which has been, such a good and enjoyable time. And I thought, what better subject for closing off the talk this year than talking about the end of the world? So, today's topic is called Apocalypse Later, excuse the terrible pun, a brief history of the end of the world. And so, what I want to do, as you know, my format already, I'm going to start off with just a bit of questions. Guys, really keep them brief. What do we understand by end of the world, or how is the world going to end? Let's go. How's the world going to end, guys?
Meteor.
Meteor.
Yeah,
Okay.
meteor, yeah.
Either we drown or we burn, bro.
Either we drown or we burn.
Either way, it's gonna be painful.
Anything else? Any other stuff? How else could it
We
end?
just run out of everything.
run out of
We
shit.
just
We just
Easter
die.
Island ourselves.
Exactly. We run out of resources.
Exactly, like dry, so we cannot survive.
A drought. We run out of water. Like run out of water, fire, too much water, meteors. What else? Historically, what do people think? How else could the world? A plague. Yeah.
The meteor.
Meteor shower. Yeah.
The Antichrist.
The Antichrist. Now we're getting there. Yeah. What else? What other kind of more pre-science? I think pre-science, de-scientify our minds. How else could the world end?
What is the final judgment?
Yeah, kind of gets a bit crazier, right? God. So, as always, and this is the proposition I want to start for the subject of the talk, right? I don't want us to think of the apocalypse as an event. I want us to think of the apocalypse as a narrative and as a way of thinking about the world. Okay? So, obviously we know that the apocalypse can end and has been projected and predicted to end in any multitude of ways. So, off the top of my head, a few of them we've got catastrophe, of course, some kind of climactic or environmental disaster. Chaos, just the basic scientific rule of entropy, that things that are ordered and structured suddenly disintegrate into something that is no longer life, intelligible, existence, just becomes chaos. We've got judgment, of course, this idea of some moral ending of the world that comes upon us and sort of decides, and it leads into our next one, either a kind of punishment or a reward. Maybe we've done a really good job. I mean, I don't think many people would make a good case for that, but maybe we've done a really good job and it all ends in some blissful nirvana-like reward where we end up in a state of rapture, where we're kind of enlightened or we ascend. The other option being that, enlightenment or renewal, that we kind of have some sort of cyclical renewal. And so those kind of people, if we had them, would say, this is all bullshit. The world isn't going to end because there is no end, because we live in a cyclical world, right? So there are so many different ways and theories and speculations that we can all posit about how this world, our existence, being, is going to end. And just a little pointer before we move on. This word end, like, remembering that end can mean two things, right? End can mean completion. You can end a task. You can get to the end. There is a positive accomplishment of a goal. And then there's the other end, which is just you run out. So a marathon runner could run and get to the end and he's, oh my God, I did it, we did it. Or he could just get to the end and just collapse and just be like, I'm done. Or even collapse midway through the race and be done. So semantics here as well. What do we mean by end? What I want to say is, when we talk about ending and creation, when we talk about destruction, we also need to think about creation, right? And I want to think of apocalypse and this notion of apocalypse within that duality of creation and destruction. Just like we think of stuff in terms of good and evil and night and day and all these dualities that we've talked about many times, we also need to think about the apocalypse in that sort of spectrum between those two periods, right? And more specifically, everyone has a theory about how the universe started. Let's assume for a second that there isn't this mysterious eternality. We have a beginning and we have an end, like any story, right? And any person who creates something has the right to eventually destroy it, right? If we believe in some kind of creator, whether that's supernatural or natural, that same creation has some kind of logical right to also give and take away. And so that's kind of the narrative with which we've always been thinking. And so we think of the apocalypse sometimes as like Doomsday and Prophecy, as an end of the world kind of thing. But actually, apocalyptic thinking has begun since the beginning of man. As long as mankind has thought, the second we got little tools and started carving ideas into stones, we started talking about the end of the world. It's been with us since the beginning. This is a tablet from Mesopotamia, 5,000 years old, where they mention things exactly like Diego was saying, death and destruction by fire. You know, the first thing that you can imagine the Neanderthal, the man, the Homo sapien encountered was just the fear of fire. So it's logical that throughout time we would always think this thing can overpower and destroy us, right? Just like water. The idea of the great flood, you know, the Epic of Gilgamesh, written 5,000 years ago, talked about a catastrophic flood. We all know the pre-Diluvian theories and well, but this massive flood theory came in 2,000 years before we started talking about Noah's Ark and all that kind of stuff. So these ideas and theories of mass singular events of destruction have been there forever. And even weirder ones, like this goddess, the goddess Ishtar, who appears in the Gilgamesh epic, is actually known by some to be the beginning of the zombie apocalypse, 5,000 years old. Of course. We just got into the bit where we were talking about zombie apocalypses.
Perfect. Just in time.
So, 5,000 years old, we had our first zombies. We have the goddess Ishtar threatening the world by saying, I shall set my face towards the infernal regions, I shall rise up the dead, and they will outnumber and eat the living. 5,000 years old. So we talk about our zombies, where do they come from? Where do they come from? They came from tablets, essentially, that thinking. But then, obviously we have these abstract ideas of beginning and end and creator and destroyer. That's kind of interesting, but it's not super interesting, and it doesn't tell us that much about the way we think today. So where that made that fundamental shift between some idea of we exist, therefore we must somehow eventually not exist, we come into the whole aspect of organized religion, right? The idea of not only having a theory of the end of the world, but marrying it to a kind of agenda, marrying it to a purpose, marrying it to guidance, saying like, we're going to create or strengthen or consolidate that innate feeling that we have that things will end, and we're going to turn that into a theory or a story that is going to profoundly impact the way we live our lives in real time. So that somewhere along the lines, humans got smart with that idea, and it said that, okay, we think about this stuff, we need to now use that stuff to make people behave in a way that will be beneficial to a society's aims, to a leader's aims, and later to a religion or a deity's aims. And so we get this term. Have any of you heard of the term eschatology? Not to be confused with scatology, which is literally the study of shit, the study of feces, a medical term. But eschatology comes from the Greek word eschatos, which means the end of things, ology being study. So eschatology is the study of the end of things. And it's a fascinating sort of field of theology, mainly, where all these different religions, mainly, as we've seen, the Abrahamic faith, so Christianity, Islam, Judaism, are the three that are linear in their thinking and that have eschatological theories about how the world might end. And so eschatology is fascinating because it created some really, really wild stories. I mean, who knows some wild stories? Let's focus for the sake of today on Christian eschatology, because Christian eschatology is the most diverse, and I would say from my kind of brief research, the most wildly imaginative in the theories that they came up with. So we've always got like Judaism, we've got ideas of promised land, we've got ideas of judgment, but through Christian and Old Testament text, we get the four horsemen of the apocalypse, which I'm sure we all are familiar with these characters. And then we get, as Victoria mentioned, the Antichrist, the idea of, again, good and evil, and then the kind of Christ and the Antichrist. In Islam, they have the false prophet, and this kind of idea of some sort of evil figure coming in and changing the horse. But then we get stranger things, like the Whore of Babylon. Who's heard of the Whore of Babylon? It's this mystical woman that's known as the Whore of Babylon, is written, I think in Revelations, actually, you can find her in the text in the Bible, and she comes on this sort of beast. This is literally from the Bible, this beast with 7 heads and 10 horns, that arises, one beast from the sea and one beast from the earth, under the authority of a dragon, in order to bring about what is known as Armageddon, which is this crazy battle of good and evil where the demons of the world will sort of come up at the point of Judgment Day, and they'll convince all the evil men and kings to form an army, and God and the righteous will have their other army, and they'll have this huge, massive battle, and this is in the scripture, ambiguously, but this is in the scripture, with these demons and these good and light and evil, and eventually there'll be a Judgment Day where all the souls of the sinful will be damned to hell and punished, as we see in this Renaissance art, and the good, worthy, righteous believers will ascend to their rightful place in heaven in this process, which I believe is called rapture. So the idea of this ecstatic union with God. Now, I don't know too much about this because I'm not of this faith, but Victoria has really kindly agreed to share a little bit of her experiences because it's fascinating to understand firsthand what these kind of stories must have felt like and what impact it would have on the way we kind of grow up and things like that. So Victoria, thank you very much for giving us a little
So what I'm going to share is not based on any scholarly background. It's just my personal experience. I was raised super Christian. I went to an evangelical Christian school. My family was really Christian, so it was deeply embedded into me. And there was this constant atmosphere of any day now, Armageddon could come. And so as children, we lived in fear of that. And now I can see retrospectively that it was a way to make us good kids. Because you wanted to make sure that you were one of these and not one of the ones that was left to like battle demons on the earth. So the first thing that they told us was that first the Antichrist will come. That will be the first step. And so as kids, there was always like rumors going around about who the Antichrist might be. So if there was a political figure that was starting to do some bad things, like Bill Clinton's policies in the 90s started becoming really intense, and we were like, oh crap, it's the Antichrist, it's begun, you better watch out. Or if there was like some sort of cult that was rising up in America, we'd be like, okay, that's the Antichrist. So the first step was the Antichrist. And then
sorry, I just brought that up. We're jumping a few slides ahead, but it's super relevant.
And then
This is true, actually. Like 13% believe that Obama was.
really?
According to public policy polling, but it happens anyway.
So then the next thing that would happen was that Armageddon would happen, and if you were good, you would be sucked up in a little beam of light as soon as everything started happening, and you wouldn't have to deal with all of the battle that would happen afterwards. So I remember as a child feeling like I better not swear, I better not do anything bad, because tomorrow might be that day, and I definitely don't want to be one of the people where all of my friends are being sucked up in these beams of light and I'm left on Earth. So I wouldn't do anything bad because I was so afraid of that. And then the final thing that was super interesting was we had a series, a teenage book series called Left Behind. There were so many books in these series and we were all obsessed with them. And it was all about, from like a teenager's perspective, the kids that were left behind on Earth. And it was like basically horror novels for us, but they were really interesting. So yeah, thankfully I outgrew all of those beliefs and I now live in relative peace inside of myself and swear occasionally.
So much. There you have it. And like it's, yeah, that book series is an absolute multiple millions of copies sold, and like you're saying, like it's not infrequent at all these different types of theories. And what's fascinating about the kind of Christian eschatology is that it's so diverse. Like as in, there are like Seventh-day Adventists and millennialists and this and that. There are so many different subsets that have radically different interpretations of maybe 5 or 6 lines of apocalyptic verse in normally the book of Revelation. So it's sort of like whoever was writing that book at the time just decided, I'm just going to throw in a bit about a beast with 7 heads and see what these fuckers make of that in 2,000 years' time, because that is the kind of case, it's so open to interpretation. But like Victoria's saying, like we kind of try to grow out of that thinking. But then with the advent of science, with the advent of reason and logic, like have we really grown out of apocalyptic thinking? Have we, or can we, better said, can we grow out of the thinking about creation and destruction and about this idea that there is an inevitable destruction, right? Because when we use science to swiftly dismiss this idea of God, in many ways that people have tried, but mainly the biggest one was the Big Bang, right? We didn't start with God, like didn't make it in 7 days, we had a Big Bang. But then it's almost like we can't help ourselves but falling into this idea of the creation, beginning and ending of a story, because with the Big Bang comes this idea of the big crunch. So the idea that the world was created by some crazy phenomena of energy that expanded the universe, and that eventually one day that same creative force will come back and destroy everything just like it created it. So just as we saw that blowing up of the Lego brick, we can't get rid of this story mentally that there is some kind of kid or something that is making stuff out of Lego and then breaking it when he decides that he's, he or she or it has had its fun. Same with the idea of the sun. Like, it's widely regarded, we establish the sun as, of course, the sun is the life force. It's what sustains humanity, it's what sustains the world. We are in the solar system. This is the system of the sun. But then there are all these theories, right, about how in 5 billion years' time, the sun is going to outgrow itself and stop being this yellow dwarf and become a red giant, gobble up all the hydrogen that's in the atmosphere, destroy and engulf all of carbon life and destroy Earth. So the sun might also be seen as that same godlike figure. It created us, gave us life, creates a system, but it also destroys the system inevitably. And this is the scientific kind of projection of where we are right now. And we're warming up, and this is, one like a scientific interpretation, that eventually we're going to become this red giant, and by around this stage, like, that is going to be an apocalypse. Like, we're not going to exist our way through that. Then, of course, there's the whole asteroid thing that many of you guys mentioned, and we're fascinated with the idea of the asteroids. We love this idea of some projectile missile from outer space coming in and destroying us in a cataclysmic event. And the reason why is because we have evidence and we know about it. It's actually real. Like, they say that we're in a 6th extinction, and we're now risking the 7th extinction. So there have been like asteroids and things that happened there, including this one. Does anyone know where the asteroid hit the dinosaurs and killed them?
Yucatan.
The Gulf of Mexico, no?
It's in the Yucatan Peninsula. It's like when you're like partying in Tulum and having a great time in Tulum, fucking like 200 meters or whatever away down the road is where the asteroid hit the Earth and destroyed people. It's called the Chicxulub crater, for anyone who's interested. And this is where it gets even madder. It's not even that we don't even know that it hit the Yucatan. We actually live in the remnants of that asteroid, because when the asteroid hit the Chicxulub crater and destroyed the dinosaurs, it led a whole radius of impact zones which created the cenotes. And the cenotes are what we go and pay money for when we're in Tulum or when we're in anywhere in the Yucatan Peninsula to go and swim and have fun and take selfies. That's literally, we're swimming in the site that destroyed the dinosaurs, which blew my mind when I learned that as well. Like, these are literally holes, prehistoric remnants, fossils of apocalypse, a scientific apocalypse, an ending of an era. And you've seen that recently. Has any of you guys seen the film Don't Look Up?
Mm-hmm.
There we go. So Don't Look Up is a classic 2021 example of our fascination, ongoing fascination with the meteor. And the idea is that society just doesn't know how we would deal with the idea of a meteor coming and striking us. But we also have this idea, which is Nibiru, which is this weird kind of almost cultish belief in something called Planet X, which is that there's this mysterious planet that at some point is going to hurtle towards Earth. I think it was meant to happen in 2012. I think it was also meant to happen in 2014. Like, it keeps getting postponed. Just like
2028, bro.
2028, yeah.
And the next one.
So Planet X is basically like, it's like a festival in COVID. It's like every year you get an email being like, oh guys, so excited for the festival. It's going to happen next year, don't worry. But we continue to like obsess about the prospect of one massive annihilation. The other one, which is really interesting, is the Yellowstone or supervolcano. Any of you don't know that, I highly suggest Googling and watching a YouTube video on this, because there is a volcano in Yellowstone that, like, who is it? Like, Joe Rogan is upset. He always talking about this volcano. But apparently it's going to blow up and engulf the entire world in fog that would basically kill us within a matter of hours. And there's a really good YouTube video where it explains exactly what would happen if it did erupt. And so, I think it erupts every like 3 or 4 million years or something, but we don't know exactly when. So essentially there's a ticking time bomb in Yellowstone National Park. But then, of course, we don't really need natural reasons for ending the world now, because in the 60s and Cold War and all that kind of stuff, we developed a little thing called the nuclear bomb, the atomic bomb, and before in the war, and we have for the first time in history, capability of destroying ourselves, which is also massive, right? It's like the idea of, when you're a little kid, you can like think about doing stuff, but it's not until you're like, you have the big guns yourself that it actually becomes a reality. So it also makes sense that we shift away from, maybe there's some God up there, like a parent up there who can tell us off. But then once you actually have the means yourself, it becomes a lot more real, because we know now that humans have the capability of destroying the world. So we have almost entered the candidacy for the bringer of destruction. It doesn't have to be God, and it doesn't have to be science, it can actually be man as well. Either cataclysmically or slowly, as with global warming. Like we all know, everyone knows about the slow destruction of the Earth through global warming. It's not really a surprise. And so in that sense, the apocalypse is coming, but it just might not be as sexy as we think it is. It might be, like we were saying, a case of we're just going to run out of stuff. And I heard a really interesting and depressing analogy, which is that humanity is like a mold on an apple, that we're essentially growing on the host, and we are slowly using up its resources until we eventually die, either, and this is what I found interesting, either from ravishing the host and destroying all the resources, or from all the toxins that fungus produces when it ravages the host. So we're basically living in this parasitic relationship with planet Earth, where we're there to stay, we're going to keep on using up its resources, and we're going to be producing all these toxins until eventually we kind of, eat ourselves to death effectively. And you can kind of see why that analogy, at least aesthetically, seems quite accurate. But then, why I think, and this is where I kind of want to open it up for discussion, where I think it's kind of interesting is like, why do we kind of care? Like, why should we care about all these different weird theories? And the reason why I think we should care is because if we return to the idea of it being a narrative, the apocalyptic narrative, and when we each sit down and think about how we think the world is going to end, it doesn't just have an interesting thing to say about our projections, it also tells us fundamentally what we believe about our own lives and about how the world works. So how we think the world will end implies how we thought it started, and it implies how we think it works. So whatever religious, scientific, or other view we take of apocalypse, it tells us fundamentally certain things about us individually, about how we think. Firstly, which is whether we think in linear or cyclical time, which is a really important one to think about in your own life. Whether you believe that there is a beginning and an end, or whether you believe that things repeatedly recycle and reuse. It also tells us whether we believe that we live in a finite existence or an infinite existence, and there's lots of academic, and I can't remember who wrote it, but there's like finite, infinite games, and the idea of people thinking, do we live in a closed system, or do we live in an open, limitless system? And then thirdly, which I think is the most important one actually, is it fundamentally tells us if we as individuals have a comedic or tragic view of life. Because if you think about Greek tragedy or Greek plays, a tragedy, aside from just being sad, a tragedy means that there is a kind of, that the arc of a tragedy is that there is a pinnacle moment and then there's a great fall. So a king might, like, let's take Macbeth in Shakespeare. Macbeth, he grows and he grows and he grows and he gets greedier and he gets greedier and he murders people and he becomes king and eventually he falls. That's a classic tragedy. Whereas a comedy is quite different. A comedy is complex and there are all these different things going on. So in Shakespeare, let's say A Midsummer Night's Dream, and there are people there are love triangles and love potions, and people's heads get turned into oxes or whatever the fuck happens there. But basically there's this crazy complexity to it, and it all seems like it's going to be bad, but eventually it comes good. And everything's kind of fine, despite all the kind of chaos. And so I think that fundamentally tells you a lot about yourself, how you view the world. And it really profoundly affects how we behave as well. We have some crazy shit of finite, tragic thinking, like the what the hell are they called? The silos in Kansas. There are survivalist silos in Kansas, which were built in 2012 and continue to be built, that sold out. These cost between $3 to $5 million, and they all sold out in Kansas. And the people have gone and bought, I think it's something like $750,000 per floor, and they are meant to like protect you from drought. They have their own fish farms inside. They could allegedly protect you from a solar flare. And people have bought this, like people have fully bought this into this with survivalist mentality.
You want one?
We've already seen how how old, archaic, religious concepts like the Antichrist have real life implications in politics. People really do project Antichrist imagery or Armageddon imagery. So this is one example. Another fascinating example is the Israel-Palestine conflict. A lot of evangelical Christian sort of fundamentalists believe that that should and is the site of the Armageddon, and so they actually don't have a motivation to sort of, not that an individual would be able to, but they don't have a motivation for it to become better. They want it to get worse because that's the site of the Armageddon, so it's like the beginning of the Armageddon. It also does even weirder stuff, like when we were in LA, we looked at a documentary. It was apocalyptic thinking that made a random bunch of hippies in California, little hippie girls, become murderers, as in the Charles Manson case. Charles Manson listened to the Beatles, of all people. He listened to the Beatles' White Album, and he decided that every song in that album was an apocalyptic message from the Beatles, who were like some divine gods, to him about the end of the world and oncoming race war. And there's a song in that called Helter Skelter, which is like, when you fall down, I come up, and it has all these lyrics that he interpreted as being basically an uprising of what he said, of black people and the downfall of white people. And he believed that fundamentally, and there are other songs called like Little Piggies, where they talk about the white privileged bourgeois piggy and stuff like that. He convinced these girls to buy into that message so much that they actually went into the mansions of the rich and famous in Los Angeles and murdered them and wrote Beatle lyrics like Helter Skelter and Piggies in blood on people's refrigerators and stuff in order to incite this race war. And they went and camped out in the desert, and that shit happened, you know? But for me, the most dangerous thing about apocalyptic thinking, and probably the most powerful thing, is it actually makes us do nothing. It makes us really stop giving a shit. Like, ultimately, I think the reason, this is just where I now go into my own theories, but I think the reason why we are fed so much zombie apocalypse, so much asteroids, so much of like the kind of disaster movies and things like that, is because it inspires inaction. If we believe that we are inevitably going to be destroyed, if we believe that there is absolutely nothing that can be done in order to tide the indestructible force of the destruction, then we become more compliant and we become less likely to engage in actually doing stuff with our lives. And so, to close off this discussion, my question to everyone is, how do you think apocalyptic thinking can be shaped to humanity's advantage rather than to its disadvantage? And what is a healthy relationship with the end of the world? Thank you very much.